April 18, 1945. The dense Bavarian forest near Kolberg, Germany, shrouded a small convoy of Sherman tanks from the 761st Tank Battalion, the Black Panthers, as they advanced through morning fog so thick the men could barely see 20 yards ahead. Outside, the temperature hovered just above freezing, a late spring chill clinging to the landscape like a stubborn memory of winter. What the men of the All-Black Tank Battalion didn't realize was that their commanding officers had just sent them directly toward a heavily fortified German position, believing the mission would likely end in their destruction. But the Germans would soon discover these weren't the easily intimidated fighters they expected. Before we dive into this story, drop a quick hi in the comments and tell me where you're watching from. It really helps support the channel. This is the remarkable account of how a segregated unit of Black American soldiers, subjected to racism, both from their enemies and within their own army, would transform from being seen as inferior fighters into warriors so feared by the Wehrmacht that their very presence on a battlefield would later cause enemy units to withdraw rather than face them again. Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens adjusted the radio headset inside his tank commander's helmet, the cold metal pressing uncomfortably against his temples. As the lead tank in the convoy, his M4 Sherman, which the crew had nicknamed Black Magic, pushed slowly through the forest, its 30-ton frame crushing the undergrowth beneath its treads. At 23, Stevens had already seen more combat than most men twice his age, having fought across France and into Germany since landing at Normandy 9 months earlier. "Eyes sharp, everyone," Stevens said into his intercom. "Intelligence reports multiple German units retreating through this area. Could be anywhere." "Yes, sir," replied Private James Wilson, the tank's driver. At just 19, Wilson was the youngest member of the crew, but had proven himself a natural at handling the Sherman's controls. "But I gotta say, something doesn't feel right. This fog is giving me the creeps." "Keep that chatter down," Stevens responded firmly, "and watch those tree lines. Germans love hiding anti-tank guns in the woods." Behind them, 4 more Shermans followed in formation, their engines growling in the morning stillness. The 761st Tank Battalion had been in near-constant combat for 183 consecutive days, a record unmatched by any other American armored unit. Despite this distinguished service, they remained segregated, often assigned the most dangerous missions, and rarely received recognition for their achievements. 15 miles away at division headquarters, Colonel Wallace Rennick studied the large tactical map spread across a table in the command tent. At 52, Rennick was a career officer who had fought in the First World War and harbored deep-seated beliefs about the capabilities of black soldiers. Beliefs that had no basis in fact, but were commonly held throughout the military establishment. "I don't expect much from this operation," Rennick remarked to Major William Tanner, his executive officer. "The 761st is all we can spare for this sector, but I doubt they'll make significant contact. Their orders are to probe the enemy positions and report back." Tanner frowned slightly. "With respect, sir, the 761st has performed exceptionally well since being committed to combat. They've taken heavy casualties, but always accomplished their objectives." "That may be, Major," Rennick replied dismissively, "but this is different. Intelligence suggests elements of the 11th Panzer Division are regrouping in that area. Elite German troops, not the conscripts and old men we've been facing lately. If the 761st does make contact, they're to hold position and wait for reinforcements." Tanner studied the map, noting the isolation of the position where the 761st was headed. "Sir, if they encounter significant enemy forces, reinforcements would take at least 3 hours to reach them." "Then let's hope they don't encounter significant forces," Rennick said, effectively ending the conversation. What neither officer knew was that Major General Ernest N. Harmon, the Corps commander, had deliberately placed the 761st in that sector precisely because intelligence had indicated heavy German presence. Unlike Rennick, Harmon had come to respect the fighting abilities of the black tankers and wanted their firepower where it would make the most difference. Back in the forest, Stevens' tank crested a small rise, providing a momentary view of the valley below before the fog closed in again. In that brief glimpse, he saw what appeared to be movement along a ridgeline approximately 800 yards ahead. "Driver, halt," Stevens ordered. Wilson immediately brought the tank to a stop, the engine idling as Stevens raised his binoculars. "What do you see, Sarge?" asked Corporal Marcus Davis, the tank's gunner. "Not sure yet," Stevens replied, straining to see through the patchy fog. "But there's something on that ridge. Radio the other tanks to hold position." Technical Sergeant Leonard Jackson, commanding the second tank in the formation, acknowledged the order and relayed it to the rest of the unit. Jackson, a former college football player from Howard University, had been with the 761st since its formation in 1942. At 28, he was one of the oldest men in the company and a steadying presence for the younger soldiers. "Stevens thinks he saw something up ahead," Jackson informed his crew. "Everyone stay alert." As if responding to Jackson's warning, the fog suddenly parted, revealing a terrifying sight. Arrayed along the ridgeline were 3 German Panther tanks, their long 75mm guns already traversing toward the American position. Behind them, Stevens could now make out at least 24 infantrymen taking up positions among the trees. "Gunner, Panther tanks at 12 o'clock, range 800 yards, Stevens shouted into his intercom. Before Davis could swing the gun into position, the distinctive crack of a German 75mm cannon split the air. The shell screamed over the Sherman's turret, missing by mere feet before exploding in the trees behind them. "All tanks, enemy contact, multiple Panthers on the ridge." Stevens radioed to the rest of the unit. "Spread out and find cover. Wilson, reverse us behind that outcropping." As Wilson skillfully backed the Sherman behind a rocky formation, Stevens assessed their situation. They were outnumbered, and the German Panthers outclassed their Shermans in both armor and firepower. A direct hit from a Panther's 75mm gun could easily penetrate a Sherman's frontal armor, while the American 75mm gun struggled to damage a Panther, except at close range or from the side. Over the radio, Stevens heard the company commander, Captain David Morgan, ordering the platoon to take defensive positions. Morgan, a white officer who had initially requested transfer when assigned to the 761st but had since become one of their strongest advocates, recognized the danger they faced. "Stevens, can you give me a count on enemy armor?" Morgan asked. 3 Panthers confirmed, sir," Stevens replied, "plus infantry support, at least a platoon's worth. They've got the high ground and clear fields of fire." "Understood. Hold your position. I'm calling for artillery support." As Morgan radioed for fire support, the German tanks began a methodical advance down the slope, using the terrain for cover while their infantry moved through the woods on their flanks. The American tankers, recognizing the threat of encirclement, adjusted their positions to cover all approaches. In the German command Panther, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber observed the American tanks through his binoculars. At 34, Weber was a veteran of the Eastern Front who had somehow survived 3 years of brutal combat against the Soviets before being transferred to the Western Front after being wounded at Kursk. "They appear to be from one of the American Negro units," Weber remarked to his gunner, Feldwebel Kurt Schmidt. "The 761st Tank Battalion, if intelligence reports are correct." Schmidt snorted derisively. "The Americans must be desperate to send their Negroes against us. This shouldn't take long." Weber wasn't so certain. "Don't underestimate them. I've heard reports that these units fight tenaciously. They have something to prove." "To whom?" "Their white masters," Schmidt laughed. "They should have stayed in America picking cotton instead of coming here to die." Weber didn't respond to the comment, instead focusing on the tactical situation. With 3 Panthers and approximately 30 infantry, he had superiority in both numbers and position. The American Shermans had taken cover, but they couldn't retreat without exposing themselves to fire. "We'll advance on a broad front," Weber ordered. "Pressure them from multiple directions and force them to divide their fire." As the German tanks began their methodical approach, Private Wilson nervously checked the gauges on his driver's panel inside Black Magic. The engine temperature was running high after their rapid maneuver to cover, and he made a minor adjustment to the throttle. "Sarge, how are we going to handle those Panthers?" Wilson asked. "Their frontal armor is too thick for our 75. "We'll have to be smarter, not stronger," Stevens replied. "Wait for them to expose their sides or rear. One good hit to the engine compartment or ammunition storage will do the job." From his position in the turret, Loader Corporal Henry Robinson passed a high-explosive shell to Davis. "For the infantry," he explained, "when they get close enough." The German advance continued methodically, the Panthers using the terrain for cover while maintaining steady pressure. Then, unexpectedly, they halted about 500 yards from the American position. For several moments, nothing happened. "What are they waiting for?" Davis wondered aloud. The answer came in the form of a voice booming through a megaphone from the German lines. The words, heavily accented but clearly understandable, carried across the valley. "Attention, American Negro soldiers! You are surrounded and outgunned. Surrender now, and you will be treated according to the Geneva Convention." Stevens and his crew exchanged glances, but remained silent, weapons trained on the German positions. After a pause, the voice continued, its tone now mocking. "Why do you fight for a country that treats you like animals? In America, you cannot even eat in the same restaurants as white men. Surrender now. Go back to America. Or better yet, go eat bananas, monkeys." The racist taunt hung in the air like poison gas. Inside black magic, Wilson's hands tightened on the controls until his knuckles whitened. Robinson muttered something under his breath that Stevens couldn't quite hear, but he could guess the content. "They're trying to provoke us into doing something stupid," Stevens said calmly. "Don't let them get to you. That's exactly what they want." Davis's voice was tight with controlled anger. "Don't worry, Sarge. I'm saving my response for the cannon." Captain Morgan's voice crackled over the radio. "All tanks, hold your fire unless they advance. Artillery support is 8 minutes out." Weber observed the American position through his binoculars, noting with satisfaction that the psychological warfare specialist attached to his unit had completed his prepared speech. The Americans had not responded, but Weber hadn't expected them to. The purpose was to unsettle them, perhaps make them act rashly. "Advance to the next position," Weber ordered. "Maintain firing disciplines. Target the lead tank first." As the German tanks resumed their advance, Schmidt couldn't resist adding his own commentary. "I heard these Negro soldiers run at the first sign of serious opposition. They lack the natural fighting spirit of proper soldiers." Weber, who had seen too many brave men die regardless of their nationality or background, merely grunted in response. After years on the Eastern Front, he had learned that courage was not determined by such superficial characteristics. Nevertheless, he had a mission to accomplish, and these American tanks stood in his way. In the American position, Stevens watched the German advance with growing concern. The Panthers were moving from cover to cover with practiced precision, making it difficult to get a clean shot. Meanwhile, the German infantry was using the terrain and fog to work their way closer to the American flanks. "Captain, they're trying to encircle us," Stevens reported over the radio. "Infantry moving through the woods on both sides." "Understood," Morgan replied. "Jackson Taylor, reposition to cover the flanks. Use your machine guns to keep their infantry pinned down." As Jackson and Staff Sergeant William Taylor moved their tanks to better defensive positions, the Germans opened fire. A Panther shell struck the ground just yards from Stevens' tank, showering it with dirt and rock fragments. "Return fire," Morgan ordered. "Make every shot count." Davis didn't need to be told twice. Sighting carefully on the lead Panther, which had momentarily exposed its side while maneuvering around a large boulder, he fired. The Sherman's 75mm gun roared, sending a high-velocity armor-piercing round downrange. The shell struck the Panther at an angle, failing to penetrate but leaving a deep gouge in its side armor. The German tank immediately reversed back into cover, its own gun traversing to return fire. For the next several minutes, a tense exchange of fire ensued. The Americans, disadvantaged by position and firepower, focused on keeping the Germans at bay rather than scoring decisive hits. The Germans, confident in their superior armor, pressed their advantage with methodical precision. Then, unexpectedly, a German shell found its mark. The round struck Taylor's tank squarely in the frontal armor, penetrating the driver's compartment. The Sherman shuddered under the impact, smoke beginning to pour from the hatches. "Taylor's hit," Jackson shouted over the radio. "They're bailing out." Stevens watched anxiously as Taylor's crew scrambled from the disabled tank, dragging their wounded driver with them. They took cover in a shallow depression behind the tank, but they were now dangerously exposed to enemy fire. "Cover them," Morgan ordered. "Machine guns on those infantry positions. Don't let them get a clear shot at Taylor's crew." As the remaining Shermans adjusted their fire to protect their comrades, Weber saw an opportunity. With one American tank disabled, he could press his advantage and force the others to withdraw. "All Panthers, advance and concentrate fire on the lead tank," Weber commanded. "Infantry, move up and target any dismounted crew." The German tanks surged forward, their 75-meter guns firing in a coordinated pattern that forced the Americans to keep their heads down. Meanwhile, the infantry began working their way toward Taylor's disabled Sherman, intent on capturing or eliminating its crew. Inside his tank, Stevens made a rapid calculation. If they stayed in their current positions, they would eventually be overwhelmed. If they retreated, Taylor's crew would be captured or killed. Artillery support was still minutes away. They needed a new approach, immediately. "Captain, I have an idea," Stevens said into his radio. "If Jackson and I advance on different angles, we can split the Germans' attention. Might give us a shot at their flanks." There was a moment of silence before Morgan replied, "That's high risk, Stevens. Those Panthers will tear you apart in the open. With respect, sir, we're getting torn apart right here. At least this way we have a chance to hit them where it hurts." After another pause, Morgan's voice returned, tense but resolute. "All right, you and Jackson advance on my signal. Thomas and I will provide covering fire and protect Taylor's crew." Stevens quickly relayed the plan to his crew. "Wilson, when I give the word, I want you to move fast. Zigzag pattern, don't give them a steady target. Davis, be ready to fire the instant you have a shot at their side armor." "Yes, sir," both men responded simultaneously. "Robinson, load armor piercing. We'll need all the penetrating power we can get." As Robinson slammed around into the breach, Morgan's voice came over the radio. "All tanks covering fire in 3, 2, 1. Now, Stevens, Jackson, move." On command, all three operational Shermans opened fire, their 75-millimeter guns and 50-caliber machine guns, creating a barrage that momentarily forced the Germans to seek cover. Seizing the opportunity, Wilson gunned Black Magic's engine, sending the tank lurching forward in a swift, erratic pattern that made it difficult to target. Simultaneously, Jackson's tank broke cover from the opposite direction, creating a pincer movement that divided the German attention. Weber, suddenly facing threats from multiple directions, had to make a quick decision on which target to prioritize. "Schmidt, target the tank on the left," Weber ordered. "Muller, Brandt, engage the one on the right." As the German gunners traversed to acquire their targets, Stevens' gambit began to pay dividends. The unexpected aggression had disrupted the German attack plan, forcing them to react rather than dictate the pace of the engagement. In the command Panther, Weber watched with grudging respect as the American tanks executed their bold maneuver. These were not the undisciplined fighters he had been led to expect. Their tactics showed courage and coordination that belied the racist taunts his propaganda specialist had thrown at them. Inside Black Magic, Wilson expertly maneuvered the tank across the uneven terrain, using every available bit of cover while maintaining their advance. Davis kept his eye pressed to the gunner's sight, waiting for the perfect moment to engage. That moment came when one of the German Panthers, attempting to track Jackson's rapidly moving tank, presented its side to Stevens' position. "Target, Panther! 3 o'clock, 300 yards!" Stevens called out. "On target!" Davis responded, his finger tightening on the trigger. "Fire!" The Sherman's gun roared, its muzzle flash briefly illuminating the fog. The armor-piercing round crossed the distance in an instant, striking the Panther precisely at the junction between its turret and hull, one of the few vulnerable points in its otherwise formidable armor. For a moment, nothing happened. Then suddenly, the German tank's turret erupted in a geyser of flame as the round penetrated the ammunition storage. The catastrophic explosion lifted the multi-ton turret completely off the hull, sending it cartwheeling through the air, before crashing back to Earth 30 yards away. "Direct hit," Robinson shouted. "Loading next round." "Good shot, Davis," Stevens said, his voice steady despite the adrenaline surging through him. "Wilson, change direction. Head for that cluster of trees at 10 o'clock. As Wilson pivoted the tank, Jackson scored his own success. His gunner placed a shot directly into the rear engine compartment of another Panther, igniting its fuel and hydraulic fluid. The German tank didn't explode, but began burning fiercely, forcing its crew to abandon the vehicle. Weber, now down to just his own tank, found himself in a suddenly precarious position. His supporting infantry, expecting an easy victory, were now pinned down by machine gun fire from the American tanks. 2 of his 3 Panthers were destroyed or disabled, and the American tanks were maneuvering aggressively to flank his position. "Schmidt, get us back to the ridge," Weber ordered. "We need to re-establish the high ground." As his driver began to execute the retreat, a shell from Morgan's tank struck the ground just yards in front of them, showering the Panther with dirt and forcing Schmidt to alter course. This defensive maneuver inadvertently exposed their flank to Stevens' tank. Davis, seeing the opportunity, didn't need to be told to fire. The Sherman's gun thundered again, sending another armor-piercing round downrange. This time, the shell struck the Panther's track assembly, shattering a section of the track and immobilizing the tank. "We've lost mobility," Schmidt reported, a note of panic entering his voice for the first time. Weber assessed the situation with the cold calculation of a veteran commander. His tank could still fight, but without mobility, it was only a matter of time before the Americans maneuvered to a position where they could penetrate his armor. Meanwhile, his infantry support was in disarray, caught in the open and taking casualties. The situation had deteriorated from certain victory to impending defeat in less than 20 minutes. Weber had seen enough battles to know when continuation would only result in needless deaths. "Signal the infantry to cease fire," Weber ordered his radioman. "Prepare to surrender." As white cloths began appearing among the German positions, Stevens ordered his crew to hold their fire, but remain vigilant. Too many times they had seen surrender used as a ruse to lure American soldiers into ambushes. "Captain, Germans appear to be surrendering," Stevens reported over the radio. "Request instructions." "Maintain your positions," Morgan replied. "I'm coming forward to assess. Keep your guns trained on those Panthers." As Morgan's tank advanced cautiously toward the German position, an officer, Weber, emerged from the command Panther's turret, hands raised. 2 more German crewmen followed, their postures reflecting defeat. Through his binoculars, Stevens could see Weber's expression, not one of fear or anger, but of resigned respect. The German officer stood straight-backed beside his disabled tank as Morgan approached. The company's interpreter, Corporal Samuel Leibowitz, who rode in Morgan's tank, translated the exchange that followed. Weber formally surrendered his forces, approximately 25 infantrymen and the surviving tank crews, to Captain Morgan. "Ask him why they surrendered so quickly," Morgan instructed Leibowitz. "They still had infantry support and 1 operational tank." After a brief exchange in German, Leibowitz translated Weber's response. He says continuing the fight would have been pointless. "Your tanks outmaneuvered his force and demonstrated superior tactics. He believed you would have destroyed his remaining armor within minutes." Morgan nodded, then asked another question that had been bothering him. "Ask him about that announcement they made earlier, about the racist taunts." When Leibowitz translated this question, Weber's expression darkened. He spoke at length, his gaze occasionally shifting to where Stevens and the other black tank commanders stood atop their vehicles. "He says it was the idea of a propaganda specialist attached to his unit," Leibowitz translated. "The specialist had been told that American Negro troops would break under psychological pressure, especially if reminded of racial discrimination. He apologizes for the insults and says he personally found them distasteful. He has fought on both fronts and has learned that courage has nothing to do with a man's color or nationality." As this translation was relayed to the tankers, Stevens exchanged glances with Jackson. Neither man spoke, but a silent understanding passed between them. They had heard such apologies before, always after defeat, never before. The final count of the engagement revealed the full extent of the 761st's victory. In less than an hour of combat, they had destroyed or disabled 3 Panther tanks, inflicted approximately 15 casualties on the German infantry, and captured 32 prisoners, all accomplished while losing only a single Sherman, whose crew had survived with just 1 injury. More impressively, they had achieved this victory despite being outnumbered and outgunned, facing German armor that was technically superior to their own. It was a testament to their training, discipline, and determination, qualities that their own army had often doubted they possessed. As the prisoners were organized for transport to the rear and medical attention was arranged for the wounded on both sides, artillery shells began landing on the ridge the Germans had occupied just an hour earlier. The fire support Morgan had requested had finally arrived, now unnecessary. "Better late than never, I suppose," Morgan remarked to Stevens as they supervised the recovery of Taylor's damaged tank. "Story of our lives, sir," Stevens replied with a hint of irony. Morgan understood the double meaning. The 761st, like other black units, had consistently received less support, poorer equipment, and more dangerous assignments than their white counterparts. Yet they had compiled a combat record that matched or exceeded many other tank battalions. The recognition they deserved always seemed to arrive better late than never, if it arrived at all. As the afternoon progressed, the fog finally burned away, revealing the full panorama of the battlefield. The destroyed German Panthers, their hulls still smoldering, stood as testament to the morning's fierce engagement. German prisoners, now subdued and reflective, sat in groups under guard, while American medics treated wounded from both sides with equal attention. Technical Sergeant Jackson approached Stevens as he supervised the attachment of a tow cable to Taylor's disabled Sherman. "Quite a morning," Jackson said, lighting a cigarette and offering one to Stevens, who declined with a shake of his head. "Could have gone better," Stevens replied, nodding toward Taylor's tank. "Could have gone a lot worse, too." Jackson took a long drag on his cigarette, exhaling slowly. "You know what gets me? That German officer apologizing for those monkey taunts like it was just some kind of tactical mistake. Like the problem was that it didn't work, not that they said it. Not much different from our own people sometimes," as Stevens said quietly. "Remember those replacement officers who came in last month? The ones who requested transfer as soon as they found out they'd been assigned to a colored unit." Jackson nodded. 3 of them got their transfers. The 4th is still waiting. "And meanwhile, we keep fighting, keep proving ourselves over and over." "That's the truth of it," Jackson agreed. "Proving ourselves to Germans who call us monkeys. Proving ourselves to our own army that doesn't want us here. Sometimes I wonder who we're really fighting." Stevens had no answer to that. It was a question that had haunted many of the men in the 761st since they'd arrived in Europe. They fought for a country that segregated them, against an enemy that despised them, all while demonstrating a level of courage and skill that should have made both positions untenable. By late afternoon, the battlefield had been secured, the wounded evacuated, and the prisoners transferred to military police units for transport to POW camps. Captain Morgan received orders to continue their advance the following morning, with reinforcements expected to arrive overnight. At the company's evening briefing, Morgan took a moment to address the men directly about the day's events. "What you accomplished today wasn't just a tactical victory," he told the assembled tank commanders and key personnel. "You faced an enemy that had every advantage: position, firepower, numbers, and you defeated them through superior skill and courage. I want you to know that I'm putting in commendations for every man involved in this action, particularly Sergeant Stevens and Sergeant Jackson, whose initiative turned the tide of the battle." The men received this news with muted satisfaction. Experience had taught them that such commendations rarely resulted in formal recognition for black soldiers. Of the more than 500 medals of honor awarded during World War II, not a single one had gone to a black service member, despite numerous documented acts of extraordinary heroism. After the briefing, as the men dispersed to their evening duties, Morgan pulled Stevens aside. "I meant what I said about those commendations," Morgan assured him, "and this time I'm going to personally follow up with Division. Make sure they don't get lost somewhere along the way." "I appreciate that, sir," Stevens replied, "but I'm not holding my breath. We didn't join up for medals anyway." "Then why did you join, Stevens?" Morgan asked, genuinely curious. "Why volunteer for tank duty when you knew the army didn't want black tankers? Why keep fighting when both the enemy and your own country question your worth?" Stevens considered the question carefully before answering. "When I was a kid in Chicago, my father used to tell me, 'Son, sometimes you have to do the right thing, even when you know it won't be appreciated.' He worked 40 years in a factory where they never promoted a colored man past janitor, no matter how skilled he was. But he went in every day and did his job better than anyone else, because that's who he chose to be. Stevens looked out across the encampment, where his fellow tankers were performing maintenance on their vehicles, writing letters home or simply resting after the day's combat. I guess that's why we're here, sir. Not for recognition, not even for a country that often doesn't recognize our humanity. We're here because it's the right thing to do, because fighting against fascism and hatred is the right thing to do, even if some of those same evils exist back home. And maybe, just maybe, by doing our part here, we can start changing things back there too. Morgan nodded slowly, a new understanding dawning in his expression. Well, for what it's worth, Stevens, it's been my honor to serve with you and your men. When I first got this assignment, I'll admit I wasn't happy about it. Now I wouldn't trade it for any other command in the European theater. As night fell over the battlefield, the men of the 761st settled into their evening routines. Equipment was maintained, wounds were dressed, and letters were written to loved ones back home. Letters that could not mention their location, the day's combat, or the persistent discrimination they faced both from the enemy and within their own ranks. In his own letter, Stevens wrote to his younger brother in Chicago, "Can't tell you where I am or what we're doing, but I can tell you that we're making a difference over here. The men in my crew are the best soldiers I've ever known, brave, skilled, and dedicated. When this war is over and we all come home, America is going to have to recognize that we've earned our place, not just as Americans, but as men. The same blood that's soaking into European soil is red, whether it comes from white soldiers or colored ones. I hope that means something when we get back." At division headquarters, Colonel Rennick was reading the preliminary after-action report from the day's engagement with growing disbelief. The 761st had not only encountered elements of the 11th Panzer Division, but had decisively defeated them, destroying 3 Panther tanks and capturing over 30 prisoners with minimal losses of their own. "This can't be accurate," Rennick muttered, looking up at Major Tanner. 3 Panthers destroyed by a single platoon of Shermans?" "The report's been verified, sir," Tanner replied, unable to keep a note of satisfaction from his voice. Captain Morgan submitted it, along with statements from the German commander, Hauptmann Weber. Apparently, the 761st executed a pincer movement that divided the German fire and allowed them to target the Panthers' vulnerable points. Rennick set the report down, his worldview visibly shaken. "I wouldn't have thought them capable of such tactical sophistication." "With respect, sir, they've been proving their capabilities since they entered combat. Their record speaks for itself. 183 consecutive days in combat, 6 major campaigns, and one of the highest enemy vehicle kill counts of any American tank battalion. And yet they remain segregated, with limited recognition." Rennick mused, more to himself than to Tanner. "That's the army we serve, sir," Tanner replied carefully. Rennick was silent for a long moment, then reached for his pen. "Have new orders prepared for the 761st. They're to spearhead tomorrow's advance through the Coburg sector. And Tanner, make sure they receive proper artillery and infantry support this time." "Yes, sir," Tanner responded, surprised but pleased by the colonel's change in attitude. "And one more thing," Rennick added. "I want Captain Morgan's commendation recommendations expedited. Special attention to Sergeants Stevens and Jackson." "That would be unprecedented for Negro soldiers, sir. So is destroying 3 Panthers in under an hour, Major. Sometimes precedents need to be broken." The next morning dawned clear and cold as the 761st prepared to resume their advance. Stevens's crew performed their final equipment checks with practiced efficiency, each man focused on his task with the quiet intensity that came from months of combat experience. As they prepared to mount up, Captain Morgan arrived with unexpected news. "Change in orders," he announced to the assembled tank commanders. "We're now the spearhead for the entire divisional advance. Intelligence believes the German resistance in this sector has largely collapsed following yesterday's engagement. Apparently, word has spread about how you handled those Panthers." A murmur of surprise ran through the group. "That's not all," Morgan continued. "Division has finally allocated us proper support. We'll have artillery on call and a full company of infantry moving with us. For once, we're not being sent in alone." Stevens exchanged glances with Jackson, both men recognizing the significance of this change. For the first time since entering combat, the 761st was being treated like any other tank battalion, not as an expendable unit to be sacrificed in high-risk operations. One last thing, Morgan added. The commendations I submitted have been expedited at Colonel Rennick's personal request. Apparently, our action yesterday made quite an impression at division. As the tanks formed up for the advance, Stevens couldn't help reflecting on the irony of their situation. It had taken extraordinary heroism, destroying 3 elite German tanks against overwhelming odds, to receive the basic respect and support that should have been their right from the beginning, and even then he knew the recognition would be limited. The full story of the 761st and other black units would be largely omitted from the official histories of the war, their achievements minimized or attributed to others. Yet as his crew took their positions and he gave the order to advance, Stevens felt a quiet pride that transcended official recognition. They had proven themselves not just as soldiers, but as men, forcing both enemies and allies to acknowledge their worth through sheer determination and skill. "Driver, advance," Stevens ordered, and Black Magic moved forward once again, leading the way into whatever challenges lay ahead. The story of the 761st Tank Battalion's victory near Coburg would not make headlines back home. It would not be celebrated in newsreels or featured in the major histories of the Second World War. But among German POWs, word spread quickly about the ferocity and skill of the American black tankers, creating a reputation that would actually cause some German units to withdraw rather than face them in subsequent encounters. More importantly, the men who served in these segregated units carried their experiences back to America after the war, where many became leaders in the burgeoning civil rights movement. Their argument was simple and powerful. If black Americans could fight and die for democracy abroad, they deserved nothing less than full equality at home. The experience of Technical Sergeant Leonard Jackson exemplified this journey. After returning to civilian life in 1946, he used the leadership skills developed in combat to organize voter registration drives in his native Georgia. When confronted by local officials attempting to block black citizens from voting, Jackson reportedly responded, "I faced Panther tanks in Germany. You think I'm going to back down now?" Staff Sergeant Johnny Stevens followed a different but equally impactful path. Using the GI Bill, he completed a degree in engineering, a field largely closed to black Americans before the war. When the company that hired him attempted to assign him to a segregated department, Stevens challenged the policy all the way to the company president, ultimately winning not just for himself, but for other black engineers who followed. The German officer Hauptmann Friedrich Weber survived the war and returned to his previous occupation as a schoolteacher. In 1965, he wrote a memoir of his wartime experiences that included a chapter on his encounter with the 761st. In it, he reflected, "What I learned that day was that courage and skill are human qualities, not racial ones. The propagandists on both sides who claimed otherwise were not just morally wrong, they were factually incorrect, as I discovered at great cost to my command." Captain Morgan remained in the Army after the war, rising to the rank of colonel. Throughout his career, he advocated for the integration of the armed forces, citing his experience with the 761st as evidence that segregation undermined military effectiveness as well as basic justice. When President Truman finally ordered the desegregation of the military in 1948, Morgan called it the right decision years too late. The 761st Tank Battalion as a whole was finally recognized with a Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, 33 years after their remarkable combat record had been established. President Jimmy Carter, in presenting the long-delayed honor, acknowledged, "This unit was denied the Presidential Unit Citation at the time of the war, but their achievements have been recognized at last. For many of the veterans, the recognition came too late." Stevens himself did not live to see it, having passed away in 1972 after a successful career as an engineer and civil rights advocate. His widow accepted his share of the honor, remarking simply, "He never fought for recognition, he fought for what was right." The morning after the battle near Coburg, as the 761st continued their advance with their new support elements, Private James Wilson asked Stevens a question that had been bothering him since the previous day's engagement. "Sarge, when those Germans called us, What they called us. Why didn't we just retreat? Why risk everything to prove ourselves to people who see us that way? Stevens considered the question carefully before answering. Wilson, do you remember your training at Camp Hood? How the instructors told us we weren't fit to be tankers? How some of them said Negro soldiers would break under pressure? Wilson nodded. And do you remember what our first commanding officer, Major Bates, told us in response? He said, "They've placed a spotlight on you. The question is, what will you do with it?" Exactly, Stevens said. We didn't advance yesterday to prove anything to those Germans, or even to the army. We advanced because it was the right tactical decision, and because we're soldiers who know our job. But every time we succeed, despite the doubts and the insults, we move that spotlight a little bit, illuminate things that have been kept in darkness too long. Wilson thought about this for a moment, then nodded. I think I understand, Sarge. It's like my grandfather used to say, do right not because of who's watching, but because of who you are. Your grandfather was a wise man, Wilson, Stevens replied with a smile. Now focus on that road ahead. We've still got a long way to go. In the decades following the war, that journey would continue, not just for the men of the 761st, but for the nation they had served with such distinction. The road toward equality remained long and difficult, marked by both progress and setbacks. But the spotlight that had been placed on them during the war never fully dimmed, continuing to illuminate both achievements that had been ignored and injustices that could no longer be denied. Perhaps the most telling epilogue came in April 1997, when the U.S. Army finally awarded the Medal of Honor to 7 Black World War II veterans, only one of whom was still living to receive it. The official citation acknowledged that these awards were long overdue, and that racial discrimination had prevented them from being granted at the time. Vernon Baker, the sole surviving recipient, spoke words that could have come directly from Sergeant Stevens 52 years earlier. I was a soldier, and I had a job to do. I did it because it was the right thing to do. In that simple statement lay the essence of what the men of the 761st and other black units had demonstrated throughout the war, that true heroism transcends the artificial barriers of race and prejudice, and that courage, skill, and dedication are indeed human qualities, not racial ones. The battle near Coburg was just one small engagement in a war that encompassed the globe and claimed millions of lives. But in that brief, intense hour of combat, fundamental truths were revealed that would eventually help transform not just the military, but the nation itself. When Weber and his men taunted the American tankers with racist insults, they had unknowingly provided the perfect backdrop against which the 761st could demonstrate the hollowness of such bigotry. Their victory was not just tactical, but moral, proving through actions rather than words that character cannot be determined by color. In the years and decades that followed, as America struggled with its continuing legacy of racial discrimination, the example of units like the 761st stood as powerful reminders of a simple truth. If black Americans had fought and died for their country's ideals abroad, they had surely earned the right to enjoy those same ideals at home. The men who returned from that war, men like Stevens and Jackson, carried with them not just combat decorations, but the unshakable knowledge of their own worth and capabilities. They had faced the best the Wehrmacht could throw at them and emerged victorious. No amount of discrimination or prejudice at home could diminish what they had accomplished or what they had become. In that sense, the true legacy of the 761st and similar units lay not just in their battlefield achievements, but in how those achievements transformed both the men themselves and, eventually, the nation they served. The confidence, leadership skills, and sense of righteous purpose they developed in combat became powerful tools in the post-war struggle for civil rights. When the 761st Tank Battalion was finally awarded its Presidential Unit Citation in 1978, the official narrative described their extraordinary heroism, proficiency, and determination to fight. What it didn't mention, but what the men themselves knew, was how those same qualities would serve them in the equally important battles they would fight after returning home. As Stevens had written to his brother, "When this war is over and we all come home, America is going to have to recognize that we've earned our place, not just as Americans, but as men. It was a prophecy that would be fulfilled not through easy acceptance, but through continued struggle and sacrifice, much like the battle they had fought near Coburg on that foggy April morning in 1945. On that day, when German voices had mockingly called them monkeys and suggested they go eat bananas, the men of the 761st had responded not with words, but with actions, demonstrating such overwhelming skill and courage that their enemies surrendered within the hour. It was a response more eloquent than any verbal rebuttal could have been, and it contained a lesson that would eventually help reshape a nation. The full extent of that reshaping would not be realized during Stevens's lifetime, or even during the lives of many of his comrades. But each victory, whether on the battlefields of Europe or in the continuing struggle for equality at home, built upon those that came before. The courage displayed near Coburg became part of the foundation upon which later progress would be built. In 2005, 60 years after the battle, a historian interviewing surviving veterans of the 761st asked Private Wilson, by then and 79-year-old grandfather, what he considered the most important legacy of his service. "We showed them who we really were," Wilson replied simply. "Not what they thought we were, but who we really were. And once you've done that, once you've really seen yourself clearly, tested against the worst the world can throw at you, well, you can't go back to accepting other people's limitations. You just can't." That refusal to accept limitations imposed by prejudice, whether from German propagandists or from their own countrymen, defined not just the 761st's response to the taunts at Coburg, but their approach to life after the war. They had proven themselves under the most extreme conditions imaginable, and that knowledge became a source of strength that neither time nor continuing discrimination could erode. When Wilson's grandson later asked him how he had found the courage to advance against those Panther tanks, knowing the German armor outclassed his own, the old soldier thought for a moment before answering. "I wasn't thinking about dying," he said. "I was thinking about living, about what kind of life I wanted to have when I got back home, and I knew I couldn't live with myself if I didn't do my job right then and there, no matter what names they called us or what odds we faced." That commitment to doing the job right, despite overwhelming obstacles, characterized not just the 761st's approach to combat, but the broader struggle for equality of which they became a part. Their example inspired subsequent generations, creating a legacy that extended far beyond the battlefield. Today, visitors to the U.S. Army Armor and Cavalry Museum can see a display honoring the 761st Tank Battalion, including photographs, combat records, and personal items donated by veterans and their families. Among these artifacts is a German Panther tank commander's binoculars captured near Coburg, a tangible reminder of a victory that transcended the merely military. More important than these physical mementos, however, is the intangible legacy of courage, determination, and dignity that the 761st and similar units left for future generations. Their story, once largely omitted from official histories, has gradually emerged as an essential chapter in America's ongoing journey toward fulfilling its founding ideals. In that journey, the battle near Coburg stands as both historical event and powerful metaphor, a moment when men who had been dismissed, denigrated, and subjected to the cruelest forms of bigotry responded not with bitterness or despair, but with transcendent courage and skill. In doing so, they not only defeated their immediate enemies, but struck a blow against the very prejudices that had placed them in that position. When the Germans taunted them with "Go eat bananas, monkeys," they had unwittingly created the perfect opportunity for the 761st to demonstrate just how wrong such racist assumptions were. The response, 3 Panther tanks destroyed and 32 prisoners captured in under an hour, spoke volumes that no verbal retort could have matched. And that, perhaps, is the most enduring lesson of their story, that the most effective answer to bigotry is not words but actions, not angry denial but quiet excellence. The men of the 761st didn't need to argue against the racist taunts. They simply rendered them absurd through their performance. As America continues to wrestle with issues of racial justice and equality, that lesson remains as relevant today as it was in that Bavarian forest over 7 decades ago. The path forward lies not in endless debate about whether equality should exist, but in creating conditions where excellence can be recognized regardless of race, gender or background, where performance rather than prejudice determines opportunity. The men of the 761st had to fight extraordinary battles, both in Europe and at home, to secure recognition that should have been automatic. Their story reminds us of both how far we've come and how far we have yet to go. A complex legacy that challenges complacency while offering hope for continued progress. In the end, that foggy morning near Coburg was more than just another World War II engagement. It was a moment when fundamental truths about human dignity and potential were demonstrated with undeniable clarity, when racist taunts were answered not with words but with actions so decisive that they forced even the enemy to acknowledge their error. As Private Wilson put it decades later, we showed them who we really were. In doing so, they helped show America itself a better version of what it could become, a nation that might eventually live up to its founding promise that all men are created equal. That promise remains imperfectly fulfilled, but the example of the 761st Tank Battalion continues to inspire those who work toward its completion. Their story stands as testament to the power of excellence as the ultimate answer to prejudice and to the enduring truth that courage, skill, and character transcend the artificial barriers of race. When Captain Morgan submitted his after-action report following the engagement near Coburg, he included a personal observation that wasn't part of the standard format. The men of the 761st Tank Battalion have today demonstrated that the only relevant measure of a soldier is performance under fire. By that standard, they have proven themselves among the finest tankers in the United States Army. It was a recognition that came too rarely during their service, but one that history has increasingly affirmed. In facing both enemy fire and racist taunts with equal courage, the men of the 761st exemplified values that transcended their era, values that continue to light the way toward a more just and equitable future. And that concludes our story. If you made it this far, please share your thoughts in the comments. What part of this historical account surprised you most? Don't forget to subscribe for more untold stories from World War II, and check out the video on screen for another incredible tale from history. Until next time.